So welcome everyone to the Ancient Egypt download of Nassim Haramein. This story is not about my story, it's really about Nassim Haramein and his information. I got to go in October with a group of 160 delegates of Nassims, and a very interesting group of people, along with the Kismet Mystery School to Egypt. And it was an amazing adventure, an amazing download of information. So this is the group of 160 that were there at the pyramids. Charlie, Foster and Kimberly Gamble, and a whole bunch of scientists, and really interesting group of people who really reached a deep understanding of what was going on there in ancient Egypt, even before the time of the pharaohs. So we're looking at the over 12,000 years ago culture. I'm going to give you a rundown of what I'm going to go through. We're going to examine the Great Pyramid of Giza and how it was built and how it was used. We're going to look at the story of our all night in all three pyramids with Nassim and his crew and our ARK crystals, which we'll talk about. Then we're going to look at the Egyptian gods, the spheres they hold, and the black hole theory of Nassim Haramein to understand what was the technology they had there. And we're going to look at what has the cataclysm 12,000 years ago that ended the megalithic stone cultures not only in Egypt but worldwide. And we're going to take a little tour up the Nile and look for evidence of this pre-cataclysmic culture. That's what we're really looking at here. We're going to take a look at the plasma wave technology that was used to carve the giant obelisk stones to give you a really clear idea of how those stones were carved using the technologies. And we're going to look at Nassim's story of Moses and Jesus and the technologies of the Ark of the Covenant and unlock those mysteries. And then we're going to look at the megalithic stone cultures around the world and even pop back to Hawaii. So here we are, Nassim and I, in front of the Sphinx. So who was Nassim Haramein? One thing I look at him as kind of like the modern day Nikola Tesla. And Nassim says, if Nikola Tesla had not been censored, we would have been traveling to the stars by now. Tesla built things and created things, and what Nassim has brought forth is of equal stature to what Tesla did so many years ago. Nassim, for instance, solved Einstein's field equations that Einstein couldn't solve during his lifetime and added torque and spin to the curvature of space-time and actually solved his equations using geometry, not just a thing. Everything he does looks at geometry first and then gets the mathematics to follow it. Most of physics does it the other way around. He's brought forth the unified field theory that basically explains everything from the micro level to the macro level, from the little proton all the way up to our known universe, and puts it in a linear relationship and combines the quantum physics and astrophysics. Actually, it takes all those physics, throws it out the window, and gives a whole new one that unifies and actually works without fudge factors. It's remarkable. He's basically given us an idea how everything is one, through the black hole theory and through his looking at the mass of things. And I'm not going to get into that this time, but it's a whole thing. He's probably best known for his black hole theory, which basically looks at the toroidal fields and everything, and the singularities at the heart of everything. And that's what we're going to be looking at right here in this whole piece. You go there, you gotta hop on your camel and go for a camel ride. I mean, in Egypt, you are what you drive, right? And you cruise across the desert. Here's Nassim and girlfriend. And of course, you got to do all the tourist things like, hold up the pyramid, do a little anti-gravity work right there. You don't want that thing to fall down. And you got to throw some big boulders around as well. And when you're a tourist over there, oops, you see his finger there holding the rock. Gave away the secret. Darn, thought you had it down. And finally, you arrive at the Great Pyramid, which is an awesome piece to behold, this magnificence. And the first thing you're told by the guides there is these little cartoon ideas of how they built the thing, how they carved those rocks with copper tools. And you can't carve granite with copper tools. They didn't have steel back then. And how they dragged them up with vine ropes and thousands of slaves, and they pierced things in there and carefully laid everything in perfectly. And when you get there, you realize how that's just a fantasy. It's like, what are those guys smoking? Like making this stuff up, just trying to rationalize things. The magnificence of it, it's not just the Great Pyramid, 3 big ones, 3 little ones, the geometry between them, the aspects of the geometry of the Great Pyramid, the phi ratios, the exactingness of how it was built, the precision is beyond mention. The first thing you do when you look down is you see these giant granite stones, and they're not just laid like blocks. They're interlocking everywhere in order to hold the test of time. And some of these stones down there are like, 50, 100, 200, 500 tons. Impossible to move any other way, especially the base stones that the whole thing is built on. And you see this everywhere, the interlockingness of it, the pieces. It wasn't just laid as a simple thing. Everything interlocks and in total precision. You look up at the pyramid, and here by the entrance, you see these totally flattened rocks. You see these holding rocks, and you see that you can't even get a credit card in between some of these. It's so tightly done, and even the precision between them is amazing. And of course, what do white boys do? They want to get into the pyramid, so they get out their cannon and they blast a hole in it, which is what that big hole was. It was a cannon trying to blast into it, and they actually hit a good spot. They hit one of the top of the resonating chambers, and actually opened it. But in the end, the opening is down below, and you'll see in that bottom corner the actual opening that we go in where the tunnels are. So they didn't hit the tunnel, but they actually hit an important spot. Another thing when you look at the stones is they all came when they were quarried, and of course where they were quarried was like hundreds of miles away on the other side of the river. It's a perfect, you see the striations in the stone where what they quarried came from the same piece. You see how the striations to the natural stone are there in that picture? And you see this everywhere, that when they quarried it, they put it back in the same way, in the same order that it was quarried from. And so you see that in the stones of how it continues throughout the whole thing, like it's one piece of stone in order to keep the resonance of the stones in harmony with each other. Everywhere you look, you'll see these, striations, the ones in between, and unevennesses carved into each other. Of course, the famous capstones. And the local lore was that the people didn't mine the capstones off of the pyramid. They were laying in rubble on the ground, like an explosion had blown them off, and they were all over the ground. And they used what they found on the ground, and they built their own houses and their temples and their mosques and everything out of those stones. So there's a lot of mining because they couldn't get these stones. They're not anywhere around Cairo. They were like hundreds of miles away upstream on the other side of the river. So it was a precious commodity. But things that were still attached, they left. For instance, here's the capstones in the very bottom, which of course you'd think would have been the first ones they would have mined, and they were still there. So the local lore was that, something blew them off of there. A giant explosion must have happened inside. It blew it and even moved some of the other rocks out of the way. And we're going to see more evidence of this, explosion that blew most of the capstones off, except for left on one. Now, inside the pyramid, you've seen this picture, all of you, of the various tunnels and the chambers, and King's chamber, and below that the Queen's chamber, and below that you don't know much about is a subterranean chamber, which was, of real interest in the subterranean chamber. So we got to, the Nassim's group, which is unheard of, got to spend all night in all chambers of all 3 pyramids. So that was, to actually travel and take time. So we were 160 of us, so we grouped into 4 groups of 40, and we went to each one of the pyramids and got our hours in each one of the chambers and got to walk and go through and take time and even do ceremony in the King's chamber, which was something they don't usually allow. You see the 3 chambers, and you see how they look. The King's chamber has the so-called sarcophagus. When they finally broke in, they thought they'd find the bones of the pharaoh in there. They didn't find it. They found a blown-up lid and a crack on the side of the sarcophagus and nothing inside. Thinking, some robbers got here before us, but that's not very logical. But they keep thinking there's something buried in those things. Well, what I'm going to purport is that these so-called sarcophaguses were not used for burial. That happened in the pharaohs, they wanted somewhere to bury their people, and they found these things and they used them. But these temples are much more ancient. The pyramids are much more ancient than the dynastic period with all the pharaohs, 4 to 6,000 years ago during the dynastic period of Egypt. And these sarcophaguses were used for a whole different function as resonators. The queen's chamber in the center with its little opening of certain ratios, and the subterranean chamber where the water is. And there's a whole pit there. So going down this long tube, that's the tunnel you go down. You have to squat the whole way to go down into the subterranean chamber. And when you get there, you find this deep pit, and they call it the unfinished chamber because it doesn't look very finished, but it wasn't about that. It was about what's underwater. And there's an underwater cavern and even an underwater sarcophagus down in the water. And even to this day, there's still water in the base of that pyramid, whereas everything else around it is dry. So what it was all about the water. It was about charging the water and using the water, because we're 90% water. Everything here is about the crystalline energy of the water. And each one of the pyramids actually had a tunnel going to the pyramid that connected it to the Nile River. And the Great Pyramid even had a temple at the end of that causeway. This is an artist's rendition of how that must have looked. And there was even retaining walls around the pyramids to hold water around it. The remnants of the walls are still there. So there was a moat around the pyramid of water around it. And so people walk down to the Sphinx and they don't realize this causeway they're walking on is actually a tunnel underneath, carrying a massive quantity of water from the river passing through the pyramids. And they must have had some powerful generators to move that quantity of water through the pyramids. You even see these wells as you walk along. You see a bunch of these deep wells, where the causeways and the water was opening up. Of course, the climate was different back then, so there was more moisture and water in that part of the world before it dried up. So this is an artist's rendition of how that temple must have looked at the end of the causeway, and the water and the walls and stuff around the temples. And even the stones at the base of the pyramid, the capstones, were a different type of stone in order to hold up to the water. So everything was about the water. And then you go in through the grand chamber, going to the king's chamber, and you notice this wall going up that comes in at an angle each step as you go stair steps back in. And what was amazing is when you hit a tone in this great hall, it's the same frequency that resonates the great hall as resonates the king's chamber, which is acoustically impossible. So there's a note you can hit right at the base of my. You hit that note in there, and the whole thing just hits in harmonics. And for this chamber to have the same harmonic as the king's chamber, as laying in the sarcophagus, is like I said, acoustically impossible. Something else going on. You look at the ratios, and they've measured the ratios of each stair step, and they're actually based on the octaves. So each octave as you go up comes in, and they're carefully tuned. Everything is resonantly tuned into harmonics of perfection in order to get that effect of being able to hit that note in this type of hallway with a slight tone and get the whole thing to vibrate and resonate. And then you get up into the king's chamber, and it's just a simple room like that, but again, the harmonics of that room is just incredible. When you hit that note, or you hit an octave above it or 2 octaves above it, because most people are ohming in an octave above that, you really get the resonance of that building. And you look at the sarcophagus itself, the so-called sarcophagus. I'll use that word, but that means a place for burying people. But originally, that's not what their intentions were. Notice the side was blown off, and there's blowholes all around the top, and the lid was blown to pieces, indicating there was an explosion inside of this that blew this thing apart, long before white people managed to finally get their way inside. And what's interesting is the Ark of the Covenant is a perfect ratio to fit perfectly inside of the Great Pyramid sarcophagus. Inside, you got the king's chamber at the base, But all above it, there's chambers and relief holes and a whole peak along the top of it, that are all, the ratios and stuff have been analyzed, and, there's harmonics and ratios, and again, in order to hold a harmony. So when this thing must have been buzzing back in the day, this thing really had some power. I mean, we think our subwoofers are good. Man, this was one heck of a subwoofer. So Nassim had this dream like 7 years ago when he was in Maui, and he talked to me that he had this dream of getting 160 people into the Great Pyramid with these special crystals he wanted to build, and oming and doing ceremony in there, and charging and bringing the resonance back to the pyramid that was lost so many years ago. And he talked to me about this dream like 7 years ago, and 7 years later he managed to pull it off. So he built these crystals. He calls it the ARK crystal, Advanced Resonant Kinetics, ARK, also for Ark of the Covenant. And the crystals were specially grown in a certain chamber, so they're grown crystals, so that the crystal lattice is perfectly aligned in a certain direction. And then they were cut in a certain way in order to hold that resonance inside. So they weren't just randomly cut; they were very precision on a certain axis cut. And then they were put inside of a titanium sleeve with some bumpers inside of it, so when you would resonate them, they wouldn't lose a resonance. And then he put them inside of a resonance chamber, which is creating the energy of a singularity, of a black hole, by spinning plasma at extremely high speeds, creating a toroidal field, bringing the energy of a black hole into a physical form electronically. And so he's working on this, an anti-gravity space drive energy, which is something that Tesla was working on when he was around, and charge these crystals up with this energy. So, and the way they're cut holds that energy. So we all had these crystals with us, and when you get 64 of them together, you get a 64 tetrahedron, which by Nassim's thing is the underlying structure of the vacuum that all sacred geometries and geometries arrives from. 64 tetrahedron is the angular thing, and the flower of life is the feminine form, and the circles, you draw circles between the node points, you get the flower of life. And even within that, you have the Sri Yantra mandala inside the 64 tetrahedron when you look at it from a corner. So all the sacred geometries arise together. So he's shown mathematically how the 64 tetrahedron is, a complete vector equilibrium where all things in balance and harmony, and everything can grow from and out of, and all the other sacred geometries arise out of this form. So we had this special night of, all night in all three pyramids. And while we were in the Great Pyramid, we got to have a 64 tetrahedron on either side of us in the sarcophagus, with everybody oming in the Great Pyramid, bringing the resonance chamber up to it. And so after hours and hours of group after group coming through and oming the resonance in the Great Pyramid, some things happened. They didn't allow us to have cameras, so we couldn't record things, but the group outside, while I was on the inside, there was a group of about 20 outside the pyramid that saw a little squadron of ET ships appear above, some lights twinkle and dance around for about 5 minutes, checking the whole thing out, and then suddenly they flitted off. This is not a picture of that, it's somebody else's photo, but it gives you the idea that what was seen that night, that somebody was noticing that there was something going on inside that pyramid that they wanted to check out. And also the leader of our group the next morning, an Egyptian leader, got a call from the Russian Space Agency. And they said, we're just really curious. We noticed some electromagnetic pulses coming off the pyramids last night, and we heard you had a group in there. We're just really curious, who was the group and what were they doing? And he got a little bit scared to talk about that, and finally he says, well, it was Nassim Haramein. Oh, Nassim, okay. They know him well. And so what we did there was empowering for everybody and empowering for the pyramid, and starts to charge up the grid of what these pyramids at all these node points all around the planet were all about. They were about charging and holding the energy of this planet in order to have a planet in harmony and balance. And so part of bringing the harmony and balance back is just to uncover these and to bring the resonance and to honor what these chambers were used for. And you walk outside the pyramids, and what you notice is really obvious is water erosion on the ruins of some of the temples around the pyramids. Now these were limestone, so they would the limestone would erode easier, but you see all this erosion patterns. Well, there wasn't any water in this area except 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, there was a worldwide cataclysm that basically plunged the planet kind of back into an ice age for 1,200 years, created what we know now as Noah's floods, huge floods all over the island, the sinking of various places, the fall of Atlantis. All this stuff was part of the worldwide cataclysm. And that was the only time there was water back then. So all the signs point to the fact that, this wasn't built during dynastic Egypt 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. It had to be pre-12,000 years ago. So I'm going to use the term pre-cataclysmic culture. The culture that built these were not around during the times of the pharaohs. They were probably, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago, perhaps, the Sphinx being perhaps the oldest. But we know that this culture was there until 12,000 years ago, when all the cultures across the planet that they were building the megalithic stone structures basically disappeared. So you see these erosion patterns, and again you see the rock striations as the strained rocks, but then all the places you see this erosion, proving that there was a time of flood where this went through floods. And the temples built around, they were granite, they were limestone in the middle, but you always see them lined on the inside and outside with granite. So a granite lining on the out and in, and limestone, thick limestone in the middle, is basically the definition of a capacitor. You have a non-conductive material, limestone in the middle. You have conductive, the rose, highly crystalline lattice of the granite material. It's a different type of granites they used. Makes a capacitor. And Nassim talks about these were resonating chambers to hold the energy of a certain power inside and to hold that resonance. They were capacitors. They were built that way. So this is the casings that were on the inside and outside of those limestones. This is hard granite, which you can't cut with copper tools. And it was done in incredible precision with these things, so tight. And you always see this form where it kind of bulges around the top and the bottom, in it. It wasn't just a flat piece. They had these little bulges at the tops and in pieces with it. And the Sphinx, which was carved out of one rock, all the way back around the outside. And you look at the face of the Sphinx, and that's not the original face. It was not the face of a man. That face is way small for what should have been there if that was a lion, like most people think the Sphinx was. And somewhere along the line, someone has said they didn't want a lion, we want a pharaoh face, and changed it. So that's not the original face. The form and everything doesn't match what's around it. Even the erosion patterns of the rest of it are much more ancient, and you see a rather new face, like it was reformed somewhere along the line. And back in the day when they found it, it was just the face sticking out of the ground. The rest of it was buried under the shifting sands and had to be dug back out. But again, the Sphinx was one giant stone. Now they've since tried to add some bricks on the outside and try to reform it to say what they think it looked like. And even the bricks now, 20 years later, are already eroding and falling apart, but the Sphinx is still there. Here you get an idea of the head and how the head is so tiny compared to the rest of it, and you'll see many other places where the Sphinx was a lion head. Now, there should have been two Sphinxes, and there's a whole area where they think the other Sphinx is, but it's like underneath city area right now. They've allowed to build, and they don't dig underneath where people are living. It's kind of an honorific thing they do there. The Sphinx is considered like a record holder, and there's tunnels deep down underneath there which they don't let the public into. And so there's some things deep underneath these and deep under the things, and there's around all these ancient sites, there's all sorts of tunnels, and there's only a small amount they let the public into or tell us what's going on with. So there's a lot of things going that, will one day surface for sure. So here's Nay and Nassim and our ever-present security guards. Wherever the 160 of us cruising around on 3 buses went, there was a little military squadron going with us to protect us, and they considered Nassim to be a rather special person and really gave us, incredible protection. I don't know if I always felt secure with them, but that was they were ever present with us. So this is one of the temples there in front of the pyramids, and with the granite on the outside and the limestone in the middle. And they built this whole little tourist thing so you can see the Sphinx and that, and you can sit there, and at nighttime, what do? Well, they do a laser show. Not a very good laser show. We could do a lot better than what they did, but it was a little bit cheesy what they came up with, but it seems to work for them. Let's talk about black holes. And Nassim uses the W for the hole, and it's the hole, not a hole. It's a hole. And if you ever get a chance, I invite you to watch this film. You can see it on Gaiam or YouTube and various things. So everything you go around Egypt, you see the gods always have a sphere with them. Here you have the gods with a sphere above the head. Now remember, these images were not cut by the pre-cataclysmic culture. They were cut by the dynastic Egypt culture in limestone. And all these depictions were done during that time of memories of a time long before that. My theory is these were real beings that were around in the pre-cataclysmic time, which were holding the energy for the religion that was evolved during dynastic Egypt. But you always see them, the importance, it's the power objects they hold in their hands, which Nassim talks about are the resonators, how they attached in to the power, and the spheres. Always the sphere above their head. And you see the gods are passing spheres to each other, and the sphere was a sign that you really had the power to hold one of these spheres, one of these energy things, and the energy pieces. Isis with a sphere above her head, and always see this whole thing. So it makes you just keep wondering, what's this thing about the spheres? What's this so important? What is this about? Everywhere you see this imagery. And there was even one point where there was one of the pharaohs who obviously had the elongated head, who wasn't quite human. And he said to everyone, quit worshiping all these gods, just worship the sphere. It's about the sphere, guys. It's not about all these gods and goddesses. And that didn't make him very popular with the priesthood, and he didn't last so long. But, again, it was about the sphere. And even when you look in other cultures, here's Göbekli Tepe, if I say the word right, in Turkey, which has been carbon dated to be 12,000 years ago, and more than 12,000 years ago. They found artifacts you can carve. You can't carbon date rock, right? Because that's millions of years old. But you can carbon date organic things that you find. And this area had gotten buried, and they found organic matter they were able to date, and it was like, 15,000 years ago was when this thing was happening. And that was exciting that they actually had dating on something finally, because it got buried with things in it they could date. This is an artist's rendition of how that looks, and it's very similar to what you see in South Africa of the stone wall things you might have heard about in South Africa around the gold mining areas. And there you see these depictions, even there, of the sphere and the gods holding the spheres. And these are in their stones. It's the same thing. And they also had the purses back then. The sphere and the purse, and they're holding the purse. And you see the same thing not over in Turkey, but you see it in the Sumerian carvings. You see the gods holding the purse. And you even see it in the Mayan ruins, in the Mayan carvings. Again, holding the purse, this power thing. It's something that's in this purse that's really valuable. And here's a close-up of those with the purses, and they're holding this thing, and it's always about passing that and having the power is in this thing. So what is this sphere all about? Well, let's put it this way. If you're an ET dude and you happen to come here from another galaxy and float into planet Earth, you came here on some sort of spaceship. And if you got a spaceship, you have an anti-gravity space drive by definition in order to go in. If you have an anti-gravity space drive, then you can warp space-time, you know, and if you can warp space-time, then you can move things around. You can make anti-gravity, and you can move big boulders with your power object that you have that's driving your spaceship. And if you have warping space-time, then you can go through wormholes, and you can actually travel through space, not by traveling for millions of miles, but by going through the wormholes in space, because you're able to navigate that, and that's how those ships navigate the planets. They go through black holes and travel across the galaxies and pop out of black holes someplace else by going through wormholes. And also, if you have an anti-gravity space drive, then you're able to direct the plasma energy and plasmify rock. So material is in four states: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And 99% of the world is plasma, which is unorganized energy stuff of the universe. And when it starts to solidify, it goes into the gas, liquid, and solid state. So what we're going to talk about is, if you have this anti-gravity space drive, then you're able to direct that energy and plasmify rock. In other words, take a solid and start moving it into liquid form. And once you're able to do that, you're able to carve it and move it and set it in place while it's a liquid, and while it dries, it makes a perfect form of the thing next to it because it's drying. And that's the secret of how these things were built, according to Nassim. So you can look again about a plasma. We represent like lightning, you know, because you apply high energy to something, you disorganize the energy, and lightning creates plasma around it. So you can imagine the force fields, you know, that's being worked. Indian Vedas talk about the Vimanas, and the Vedic text perfectly describes spaceships and the anti-gravity space drives that were with it, and they totally describe how the gods are moving around in space, and how their vehicles, and they even built their temples to resemble what they saw floating in the skies. And, you know, there's imagery of it. And there's diagrams, and there's descriptions of, you know, how the spinning wheels were inside, and how the fields happened. And they beautifully describe it. And Nikola Tesla, you know, also studied these and looked at them and understood, you know, what there's a field inside of it. So what Nassim's brilliance is to look at the fields that create, you know, how these things worked. You've seen this, the double tube torus, right? The double torus. The top hemisphere spins one way, the other hemisphere spins the other. The energy goes out through the corner of the event horizon, down through the middle, to singularity in the center, and then arises back on the other side, comes back into form. So this field you see everywhere in everything, and Nassim talks about this field is, you know, the basic building block of how energy congeals. You have to have a singularity, you have to have what he uses, a singularity better than a black hole. It's the point where you come to unity consciousness, unity in the middle, that 0 point. And we know that atoms blink on and off. You know, they're here, and then they're not here. They're here, they're not here. Because even atoms have the toroidal fields around them. So here's another type of thing where you see the field of the toroidal field, the sphere, and in the center is a black hole. A singularity point, the 0 point in the middle. And so that's what we're talking about here. The galaxy has that same sort of thing. Everything spins out from the galaxy from a black hole in the center. And we know there's a black hole in the center of every galaxy now. Nassim predicted that years ago, and now they're discovering, yes, there's a black hole in the center of every galaxy. And everything spins out on a plane across the center, just like our galaxy, in a spiral. And then it goes to the edge of the event horizon, the force of the black hole in the center that holds it in, and goes back to the north and south poles and goes back into the center and recycles. So as the galaxies get older and older, the sphere gets more and more, and they'll eventually reach their, you know, they're always expanding, and they reach their edge of their ability to expand, and then they implode and go back to 0 again and start over. It's the cycle of galaxies. And everything has to have this spin in order to overcome the force of gravity, which is the singularity in the center. So this is Nassim's brilliance to understand, like science has never understood, well, what's gravity? We don't know what it is, but it's a huge force. And it's the center of everything. Gravity is the force of the singularity, the center, and spin is the force out. So he simplified everything to 2 vectors. Gravity, singularity, the center, and spin that keeps it in. So everything must have a spin to it in order to be alive. Just like humans. We have a field around us, a toroidal field, and the center of that field is our heart, and our heart is our singularity, where we connect with all other beings. And that's our 0 point, right here in the center. And the toroidal field spinning in the different directions of the kundalini energy on all coming to singularity in the heart. The Tibetan Buddhists understood this really well. They would talk about body, speech, and mind. Body being the mind up here, speech, the throat, and the mind, the heart. This is our mind. This is our intelligence right here at our heart. This is our computer up on our head. It's a wonderful computer, but here's a computer programmer down here in the heart. And they understood that whole piece and the whole thing. You also see that with the Merkaba field that people talk about and popular by Drunvalo Melchizedek, and the same field effect that you'll see in that fits into the Merkaba as you do that as another type of geometry, the same toroidal field. We know that there's a supermassive black hole in the center of our known universe. Known universe is as far as we can see before light spins and we can't see outside. It's inside of our event horizon from the black hole in the center. And everything arises and comes back to the black hole. And we now know the center of every galaxy there's a black hole. When the Sim takes it right on down, because everything's a fractal reality of each other. There's a black hole in the center of every star. And in the center of every sun, there's a black hole. In the center of our sun, there's a black hole. In the center of every planet, there's a black hole. And yes, our planet is hollow, and there's a black hole, star, power sun in the center. In the center of every being, living being, because again, we're another spinning toroidal field, there's a black hole. In the center of every cell of the body, there's another singularity in the center of that called the nucleus, and it also spins into the toroidal field. In the center of every atom, the proton acts as another black hole, which is his part of Nassim's physics to explain, what the atom and the fields and stuff we're doing. We're seeing a fractal reality of the macro to the micro. We all know we're a holographic fractal reality, and so in order to understand that, what is the we are a part of this whole. We're a little holographic imprint of the whole. And so what must be in the galaxy, we are seeing right here. So even us human beings, we're acting like a little galaxy with spinning energy coming out from our heart field that the heart math people can measure, going out like 20 feet from us. We have a toroidal field coming back in through our kundalini, top and bottom, back to our singularity at the center. You see these same things in the galaxies, in their Milky Way. You see the Milky Way in the center, and they can measure these gamma ray emissions going out, creating the toroidal field around our galaxy and around other galaxies. You can see the same thing in quasars and collapsars, and they can measure these fields and see these same toroidal fields everywhere in space. You can look in the microcosm, and you can see even the splitting of the atom, or the splitting of the, as cells grow and cell growth, follow the same toroidal fields. And you see this, again here, you're looking at, trees and the human and the fields. Everything follows the double tube torus pattern, the toroidal field with the singularity at the center. It even follows our sacred geometries. As we grow into the flower of life, you see those same patterns in cell division growing up, and you see the same patterns in the galactic world as well. So the microcosm must follow the macrocosm, and this is Nassim's brilliance for giving us a unified field theory that unifies the macro and the microcosm. In the micro level, the quantum physics beautifully describes what's happening in the micro level, but with some huge fudge factors, like major 10 to the 26th, like huge number of fudge factors that they don't understand. And astrophysics kind of describes things in the astral level, but they don't cross over and describe each other. And so Nassim's physics describes everything in a unified field theory and brings it all together into one. And that's where he's totally like taken quantum physics and string theory and thrown that out the window and created a whole new physics, which is creating a lot of resistance from the science world trying to accept this, but eventually they'll have to because it's the way it works. That's why he's really wanting to train the real people out there to get it, so the mass consciousness will get this information and it'll kind of get back into the scientists who will have to discover it themselves for themselves and take the egoic growth for it, and that's okay, as long as it gets out there. So again, the going cell division and everything following that. So this is what, if you take a toroidal field effect, right, and you want to create it in a laboratory, that's kind of like how these space drives are working. They're creating that same thing of spinning plasma in a toroidal field and creating all the same fields that you would see, in a singularity. These are the waveforms that you see coming out, like same thing you see in a galaxy, in the galactic center. So he's created that in a chamber in order to spin the plasma and create the toroidal field electronically and be able to synthesize a black hole, which is, we're doing it crudely with, electronics and wires and tubes, but we're just a 100,000-year-old civilization, maybe that old. But imagine when we're a 1,000,000-year-old civilization, we're not going to be making things with, vacuum tubes and wires, and our computers are not going to have a mouse and a keyboard. They're going to be, controlled by consciousness, which is how these things are controlled. So there's an artist's representation of his chamber that he's trying to make. So the spheres are like little black holes organically created or ordered on galactic eBay and brought to planet Earth. And there, Nassim talks about there were thousands of these things across the planet. If you are building things with giant rocks, if you're a monolithic stone culture, you had to have one of these in order to plasmify the rocks, move them, and carve them. You had to liquefy the rocks. That's how it was done. This is the technology that was being done. It's not a lost art. We understand this much, and we're beginning to be able to understand how we can create that. The story of Atlantis, we all know that story, and most of what we know from Atlantis actually was brought to us by Plato, because Plato wrote a lot of stuff down, had a prolific writer of books, and those things stayed with us to this day. And he went to Egypt back in the day and talked to the priesthood, which was pretty tuned in priesthood in Egypt, and learned the mysteries and started his own mystery schools. And, so most of what we know about Atlantis came from the priesthood of Egypt, and the descriptions of, how it looks and the rings around it, and the very center was this giant crystal, they call it, the giant power object, a giant singularity in the center of Atlantis. And the lore was that Atlantis didn't just sink all by itself because of something happened. The bad boys kind of started running things in Atlantis and started having evil intentions and ideas of power and control, and didn't run the frequencies right, and they basically blew themselves up. So they always try to talk about, Atlantis just sunk, but you really look into the writings of Plato, and it's very clear, no, they blew themselves up because they overused the power. They didn't use it properly. And it must have been a massive explosion to sink a whole continent and shift whole shells. And the time period for that, 12,000 years ago, according to Plato. The same time that we see all this other stuff. Now let's look at the records. This is mainland, central Greenland temperatures. And you see here the time period. And you'll see back 16,000 years ago at the beginning of this graph, it was pretty cold. It was an ice age. And then suddenly it hit a boom and gets nice and warm and then levels off and has a nice, good long couple thousand year period of some nice warm weather for back then, coming out of the ice age. And then around 12,000 300 years ago, suddenly there was a dramatic drop in temperature in the records, in the ice records, in the records of the planet. And it basically plunged us into an ice age that lasted for about 1,200 years, and then suddenly, boom, warmed back up again, and then warmed up even more and created the stable temperatures from 10,000 years ago till now. So this was the timing of when these civilizations disappeared, not just here, but in Peru, in Turkey, and other places I'm sure as well. But those are the ones that I know about. And that was a time period of something big cataclysm on this planet. And it basically threw us into no civilization on this planet for practically 6,000 years. It wasn't until about 6,000 years ago that civilization started to regrow on this planet. We got that in Egypt, 4,000 BC. We see the rise of that. The Sumerian, we see the rise of that. We basically had like a 6,000 year period of no real civilizations on this planet that we know about. We think history started 6,000 years ago, and we don't think about anything before that. But there was a whole nother thing that was happening. There's many theories about what this was that happened. People try to purport that there was a comet that hit the Earth and shifted the plates of the Earth and caused big areas to sink and others to rise, and put all sorts of material in the stratosphere that cooled down the planet, and yeah, possibly. But what we see in those temples of Egypt were explosions from the inside. The stones of the Great Pyramid were actually moved outward a few centimeters, and they have to take that into effect when they're starting to do it and figure out the size of it. Certain areas were blown out. All the capstones were blown off and laying on the ground in rubble. The sarcophaguses were blown. And we even look at the temples that we see all over the place, and there were signs all those blew up, because you see stones blown one side and out the other, either direction, long distance. You'll see, 20-ton blocks, blown 100 meters this way and 50 meters that way. If there was an earthquake, things would have fallen to the center. But the ancient temples didn't do that. Everything was blown outward from the outside in. And they all had these singularities. They all had sarcophaguses in the center of them, and they all had that whole thing. So even though there's a lot of good lore that says, okay, a comet hit the Earth, and maybe that's what happened, that could have been a part of it. But that doesn't explain all the things that we're seeing and all the things I saw. And I was really curious, what was this cataclysm that happened? The standard explanation just wasn't working for me. You look in ancient India, and they have these type of things that, these kind of things that look like a nuclear bomb and nuclear explosions. The gods had some powerful things and were having some little wars across each other. And the Vimanas talk about, in the Vedic text, they talk about the wars the gods had in the skies, and they were throwing huge things at each other, creating fire in the sky. And again, it wasn't now 6,000 years ago that civilizations reformed. And you further beginning Sumerian and Egyptian Old Kingdom at the 6,000 year point. So you had 6,000 years of nothing, and finally 6,000 years ago, time happened. So there's a timeline here. The early dynastic Egypt, starting around 4,000 BC, and finally really the early kingdoms, 3,000, and by 2,000 BC it was really rocking, and around 1500 it kind of peaked out, and that's when they had the peak of they were really building incredible temples and moving big stones and able to do things. And then suddenly after that there was no more building of temples. It kind of ended 1500 BC, and nothing really got built after that time, and things started to degenerate. The Libyans took over, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all in succession, kind of ruling it, and Egypt degenerated and didn't work out. So when I say that there were singularities inside of each of these sarcophaguses all around the world, and the big one in Egypt blew up, all of these singularities are connected, they interact with each other, and we're all connected by wormholes. So this is how we're all connected in Nassim's view of the cosmology of the universe. And every black hole is connected through every other black hole through tiny wormholes. This is something that science understands as well, although they don't quite understand the whole piece of it, but Nassim has a good idea of what happened. And the vision I got when I was there, because I kept asking this question, what was this cataclysm? Okay, the big one, mother crystal of Atlantis, goes off and blows up that whole planet. Well, all the singularities are connected through wormholes, so if one goes off, wouldn't they all blow up together? And I had this whole aha moment of like seeing this whole picture of everything popping all over the place. And we see the same thing in Peru. The ancient temples of Peru were blown up and huge boulders blown from one side, particularly on the east-west axis. And the Kismet Mystery School kept pointing that out and seeing how everything was blown. There's signs of this huge explosion. And so what I saw was this whole explosion of all the singularities kind of creating what we would call a nuclear winter, wiping out all these civilizations off the face of this planet, not even leaving, toasting all organic matter and basically leaving this planet as, hunter-gatherers until we could get it back together again 6,000 years ago and start making civilizations on this planet. I told that theory to Nassim when I saw this whole piece, and he said, "Wow, I like that. Yeah, they would all be entangled with each other, and if one would go, they could all go, and that's what we're seeing. I like that idea. I'm going to give this serious consideration. I think you might have hit something there." So this is what I saw. It excited me. So this was the first real pyramid built in Egypt that there was a history of. They were little limestone blocks all stacked up on top of each other in a step pyramid, which is a lot easier to build because the forces of gravity, it's a lot easier to build a step pyramid with big blocks than a full pyramid, which is really difficult to build. There's a history of it. We know it was done. Little limestone blocks stacked up. They're working right now to try to rebuild it. But it was built on top of the ruins of the ancient civilization. Underneath this, there's huge granite slabs that this is sitting on top of. And there's tunnels underneath this and whole caverns and stuff underneath this pyramid. So they built their dynastic Egypt stuff on the ruins of the pre-cataclysmic culture. And everywhere we go, we saw evidence of this. Everywhere the temples were in the modern, we're going to say modern, that was 6,000 years ago, historical times, was built on the pre-cataclysmic ruins of what was there before. There was this little room right here next to this pyramid that you could walk into, and you put your head in this little chamber, and you could feel this energy, which I called helicopters. It would go like that, and would just vibrate your whole body, and you'd feel this whole body sensation, like there was still some power object in the tunnels deep underneath this little piece here, underneath this little pyramid that still had the power. And this whole area was amazing. This is a dynastic period wall built around a pre-cataclysmic culture stone. And you get in, you find the sarcophagus, and you look at the lid of that sarcophagus, and what do you see? It's all blown around the edges of it. And you see this in so many of the sarcophaguses. You see these signs of the blow. Now this is a hard granite, impeccably built, even the molecular structure of the rock has been realigned into perfection to really be a resonator chamber. And underneath this whole temple where we were talking about, there was the most fascinating tunnels that they actually let the public into. Because inside of these tunnels, on either side of the tunnel, as you're walking inside, you see sarcophaguses with huge lids over them, and they were all open when they found them. They were all slightly open and in full form. None of them were blown up. And they were all empty. So when they finally found this cavern and went through it, you can imagine, they found room after room of these, and each sarcophagus was a different stone. And the opening to get it in there was like impossible, to try to get one of these things floated in there was like, deep down in the earth through these tunnels is like just a whole impossibility. And even the carving in the tunnels, they had some obviously serious technology that could plasmify rocks and dig these tunnels. By the way, our military has a technology for digging tunnels. They have big machines that grind doing these tunnels, and part of the North American continent is looking like Swiss cheese with all these tunnels they're doing underneath. And afterwards, Nassim talks about the fire, the military has a technology to plasmify about 1/4 inch of the rock around the outside and liquefy it and reform it so that the tunnel holds up and doesn't collapse. So they dig the tunnel with a machine, and they come by with another machine with these incredible lights and powers. It's automatic, robotically run, and liquefies a little layer of the outside, and we can only get like a few a centimeter or so deep, but that's enough in order to solidify these tunnels in order to not have them collapse. So these are the sarcophaguses that we saw, the capacitance chambers, the boxes that held the singularities, and maybe this is where they were breeding them, but each one was different, each one was made of a different stone. It was really remarkable. Now, of course, when they put these steel things around it in order to hold up the outside so people can come down, they did a beautiful job of restoring it and opening these things back up. But there was one sarcophagus, one box, that lid was closed, and they thought maybe it was something inside of it, but the lid was too heavy for them to move back then. So instead of moving it or anything else, they decided to throw a stick of dynamite in it and blow a hole. So they blew it up, hoping they would find their prize inside, and it was also empty. So this, the tunnel work underneath these things is incredible, how many tunnels there is, and how little that we're actually told about of what's in all these tunnels. And you'll also see, wherever you see these tunnels, you see these deep wells, because again, it was about the water and about moving water in chambers and stuff and holding them and charging it. So, of course, in Egypt, you are what you drive. So I got an upgrade. I got my donkey, and we're going to cruise down the desert and go to our next temple. And this one was really interesting. They had rebuilt these towers here, but some of the walls and the base were still intact, where you could see the limestone in the middle and the granite on the inside and the outside, and had this little pyramid. And there was a waterway, a causeway going from that pyramid all the way down to the Nile, which is what this whole piece is in the middle. Again, you see these causeways from the pyramids down to the Nile River. So we're walking on that causeway of a tunnel underneath. And you can see the brilliance of how the stones are put together, interlocked with the granite on the inside and granite on the outside. And some of these are still intact. Of course, the locals mined anything they found laying around, but anything that was still intact, they sort of left that out of respect. So they didn't take that away. Or not all of it, at least. And again, here's this causeway going from that pyramid all the way down, to the ocean with a tunnel moving the water. And also, talking about water, they made these beautiful hot tubs made of these incredible crystalline stones, one piece carved, incredible things, and sitting on those things was just like you were sitting in some hot water. It was in the hot desert too, but it was really powerful to lay in these things. And you can see all the crystalline structure of these tubs and tubes, and we call them hot tubs because that's how we think, but they were probably doing some incredibly alchemy with these things of, turning things and using the waters of the charged and doing things with it. But we see them as a hot tub. But the central piece for this was this Rosetta Stone right here, right in front of the pyramid. And this stone is super deep and super charged and super wow, you stand on that thing and you're zooming energy up to the cosmos. And that stone is a really crystalline type of special stone. They don't even quite know what it is. And it goes way, way down into the earth. So part of the job with Nassim is to recharge everything. So we put our 64 tetrahedron in the center and had our crystals, and we spent an hour, ohming and sending energy and connecting with the power of this in order to recharge what must have been an incredible piece back in its day. I mean, it's one heck of a subwoofer, guys. But the energy field we made with this was just incredible to have this group and that level of intention and integrity and clarity and understanding of all Nassim's work, because these are all delegates who had been trained by him and gone through the training program and had all the basic information. So most of the best stuff was actually been drug off to foreign museums, you know, and the best stuff is in museums in other parts of the world, because the white people would come and, quote, discover it and then scam it off. But there is some great things in the I mean, there's so much stuff in Egypt. It's incredible in the museums. So you really look at this stone, and it's an incredibly hard stone carved. You know, they did not have the technology during dynastic Egypt to make things like this. But you'd see this type of emblem right there was like a stamp that would say, hi, I'm a king, I'm a ruler, I have this stamp and I make the laws and I call the rules. So that's like a ruling class. And then you see another who's the priest class, and you see they're always holding this power object in their hand, this tube, this sphere, you know, showing, well, I have the power to connect the singularity and move energy. And again, these singularities, just like spaceships, aren't run by computers with a mouse and a keyboard. They're run by consciousness that you connect with. And even the spaceships that, you know, like the one in Roswell, Area 51, in the 50s that crashed, that they found, and people are coming forward now and describing what they saw and what it is, and they all describe the same thing. There were plates. You know, they weren't a bunch of knobs and dials and, you know, meters and stuff like we would think on a ship now. They were like plates that the beings that were running them would put their hands on and connect consciousness to move it. So you had to have consciousness in order to operate a singularity. You had to be high consciousness to be able to have one on top of your head, or you're going to get fried. You know, common people couldn't go near these things. They had to be a long ways away. They were held inside the sarcophagus to hold the power, because those are capacitance chambers. And probably back in the day, they were lined with gold and silver on the outside, which has fallen apart today, to make super capacitors. And you see all sorts of, in the frescoes, you see all sorts of technologies these guys are wearing. This is just a few of them. I got so many pictures of this type of stuff. And you see that little thing he's wearing there, you know, looks like a little gizmo, right? And like it's some technology. It's not just a nice little thing he's wearing. It's got something there. And you see this, you know, in many different things, and these little gizmos they're wearing, and connections, and they're holding things in their hands and working the power objects and connecting with the consciousness, the power of the singularity, in order to move rocks and do alchemy and have long life and you know, connect to other places. And it must have been a really powerful thing. But that was only for the high priesthood, who could really connect in and be a pure consciousness to operate these things. So you see everywhere all these gizmos and things that they're holding that look like little modern day computer things. And the quality of the stones and the statuary was just incredible. So you can see, if this is left over from 12,000 years ago, and then New Egypt forms, they see this is going to be their gods to them. This is, you know, that lineage continues. You see on the bottom, you see these little hieroglyphs put in there. Well, that was not originally. That was like graffiti, you know, poorly cranked into the stone, where, you know, dynastic Egypt is trying to say, oh, by the way, this is us, and this, we built this, and we had this, and they're all dating it to say, oh, that's you know, King Ramses put his name on that, so that must be a statue of King Ramses. No. King Ramses put his name on it, but that's not a statue of King Ramses. But this is the fallacy of what Egyptology is coming up with. This is a beautiful example of a sarcophagus, and what's interesting is the striations of the lid on the top perfectly matches. If you take that lid and you flip it upside down and put it on the bottom side on the under, they cut the lid from the same piece of stone on the bottom, flipped it over, and put it on the top as a lid in order to hold the same energy. And you see this on all the sarcophaguses. If you take it and you turn the lid over, you put it on the bottom side, and you'll see all the striations of the stones matching up perfectly. And this one was just so obvious because it's such a crystalline structure, you can see it. And when I told you about that place we went where you put your head inside and you go, when you hear the helicopters, well, this is what it looked like, and this one was robbed from its original place and put in a museum. But you know what? You put your head inside of that, and it's not powerful, but you still hear the helicopter sound, like it's still holding the charge, even though it's sitting here in a museum. So many of the pieces in the museum still hold some energy, and people are able to connect up with these statues and connect up with other life forms. And they have one that I said, what is it, Atma? Atamra, get it right. Who was one of the pharaohs, and his body and form was obviously not quite human. Has that whole alien look with a small neck, a big head. And he was the one that told everybody, okay, stop praying to these gods. You all got it wrong. Just pray to the singularities. Simplify it, guys. Let's not do all this stuff. And he wasn't, taken very well by the priesthood. But that's how he looked at it right there. Like, that's the power, the singularity. That's where the power center comes from, and that's where we connect in with. So that's a picture of his head. You think he might just happen to have, a hat on top, and that's what they try to say. But these are statues of his daughters. And take a look at those heads. Now, not all the pharaohs had that, but this one was definitely, during dynastic Egypt, you can tell that it was not a fully human form. And that's his other daughter right there. And this, missing capstone from a pyramid. Who knows exactly where that came from? But that's a powerful little piece. So everywhere you see inside these, it's worth going through all of the museums and really regarding everything they have, because you don't see all these things out there in the temples. They've all been removed and brought in a museum in safekeeping. And again, to carve this, there's flint kind of mixed in with this hard rock, and you would have to have like serious grinders and polishers and, even us today to try to do it. And the precision of how each one was done was like a CNC precision. I mean, it's like a computer drawn type of thing with total precision in every little aspect. And even the huge statues, the precision of the carvings were incredible. You also see things like this, like a neck rest, which you also see in ancient Chinese. So obviously some connection there. Another interesting gizmo was this umbrella with hinges on it, with metal made of copper, and a hinging system for the umbrella to come out and be able to move it. An early umbrella. Well, the amazing pyramid is called the Bent Pyramid. It's also on the Giza Plateau, but not in the same place where it's further upriver, but still within the region. And the Bent Pyramid is two different angles on it, but the capstones are still in it. So you get to see what it was like and the incredible precision of the capstones and how that was in its original form. So whatever happened, the capstones didn't get blown off of this one. And those angles are not random, they're exact angles of phi ratios. And so you see the total precision, like the perfect line of that piece, down to the centimeter of precision, like a computer drawn type of piece. And when you look at it, you see the capstones are sitting on top of these rough stones. You start to understand why the base stones are rough, because the capstones sit on it. But could you imagine carving each one of those capstones, the incredibly large pieces, in order to perfectly fit inside? What Nassim talks about is the rocks were plasmified, brought into a liquid form, and then you can shove them in there and they'll perfectly fit in with whatever the base is and perfectly form that, which is why you have that perfect formation, and it sits on there in total precision. In 20,000, however many years later, it's still in perfect form. And so that was exciting to see how that was done. Here's an angle from the side, and again you can see the perfect flatness of the top of the form as you look up it. And you can see how the capstones, these massive capstones, were perfectly lodged in and holding in the bases. And just this shot here is hard to show, but it really shows that precision, that perfect line of, of however many years later, more than 12,000 years later, still in perfect alignment. And there was a spot in the front of this bent pyramid where there was a chamber built of, giant granite rocks, original piece. And you can lay in that chamber with your head on a certain type of stone, and you could feel just the whole. You could still feel the helicopters of sound vibrating your body as you're laying in this chamber, with your head toward the pyramid. Well, there's a definite power spot, so there's still energy deep in the ground underneath these things that are still there today. It's by no means a dead, archaic object. So there's a city of Memphis that was the capital of ancient Egypt, and then later during dynastic Egypt. And there's these giant statues, and if you look at this one again, what's his head look like? Elongated head. Cone head. And there's this massive statue that was so massive they had to leave it where it was and build a building around it to protect it. But what's interesting is on one side of this massive statue, you see erosion patterns of water lapping up on it over the years. Obviously, water was moving, eroding this, hitting it. So that, it was during the great floods, the flood of Noah, as we think of it now, 12,000 years ago during the Cataclysm, where we had 1,000 years of some crazy weather that was lapping up and creating this erosion. Because you look on one side, it's all eroded, and you look on the other side, no erosion. Obviously hitting one side, not the other. And the precision of something this large, the people who measure it, using laser technology to reform it, the precision of left and right is right down to the millimeter. The way that everything is drawn in is in total precision and incredibleness. Letting you know there was some serious technology in carving these things. They weren't just someone hacking away with a copper tool. So then we'd finished up our tour of Egypt area, and we went up the Nile. There were 80 of us and then got in a riverboat, and so we hopped in the riverboat and had this beautiful, luxurious river going up the Nile. And it's really, the boat was I felt like I was in the Titanic. It was something really special. Okay, not that one. But the Temple of the Hathors was the one that really rocked my boat of all the places we went to. The limestone, now again, these are built during dynastic Egypt, but you can see these massive limestone pieces that were moved up. Obviously, and Nassim talks about, they still had a singularity left during dynastic Egypt that was left for them, and only the priesthood of high caste could actually operate this thing. And they didn't have enough consciousness in order to plasmify rock and be able to cut granite, but they did have enough to use that in order to levitate and move the giant rocks up. And that's how these rocks during dynastic Egypt were moved, but they're limestone, they weren't granite. But you see the base of these things were granite stones, again indicating it was built on top of the ancient ruins of something once before. And the Hathor faces had been bashed out, but when it was the sand actually came up almost to these faces right here. It was filled with sand from the shifting sand of the ages, and they had to all be excavated back out again. But someone decided they didn't like those Hathor facers and defaced them. But in the top of every temple, you see a sphere, a singularity with wings. Looks kind of like a Sufi heart with wings, huh? And you see that above every temple entrance and every temple opening, indicating the power object that runs this. And you really get an idea of the massive size and the beauty of this. So what was interesting about this one, if you look up at that ceiling, you'll see one side is black and one side is clean. It's like they put this soot type of something over it that nobody could figure out how to remove until modern times. We figure out finally how to etch that off chemically without destroying what's underneath it. Almost like somebody back in antiquity said, let's cover these things over while these bozos are out here until someone can actually appreciate it and has the technology to open it, and then they can see the color and really see the form of what's underneath it. So one half of the temple they've done, and they left this one half down the center so you could really see what it was like. And the ceilings are incredible, all the carvings in limestone done during dynastic Egypt. The Eye of Horus talks about, you see that inside of the singularity, indicating that's the 0 point, the center of the sphere, the black hole in the center, indicating what the Eye of Horus truly represents in Nassim's point of view. There's many other Egyptology points of view of these things. And you see a lot of indications of ships and boats of traveling through time and traveling through the universe in a boat. And Nassim sees that as these are ships, but they're going to see a boat on water, but we know that's actually traveling through space and time on other sorts of ships. But they use that as symbology of the gods on a ship. And you'll see the symbologies of the coil on top of the platform where the singularity would go, indicating a waveform, power forms, wave energies coming out from that. And again, you all see the spheres. It's all about the spheres and the energy of the spheres. And what was amazing in this one, you go down to this tunnel, which usually they lock up, but they opened it for us. And you go down underneath into this incredible cavern. And you look on the walls of this, and there's a really special thing people call the Bagdad Battery. It's really showing, you can see how there's a little insulator underneath with different layers, and the hand holding it up, and the power inside. It really shows some alchemy going on, what they were able to do. And they did have light bulbs. They had lights back then. When you see the temples, there weren't like piles of soot all over everything of people having torches for years, burning, yak butter and making torches. They actually had areas to illuminate things with light. And the ever-present Hathors. I love those guys. So this temple was all about the Hathors, and you go up this stairway, going up and up, and you go up to a roof. And all along the stairway, there's all sorts of tales about ascension and different levels of consciousness. And you get up to the roof, and little Hathor heads are still intact up there. And what was amazing on the very top is there's this platform and a walkway going up to the top of it made of limestone. And Nassim talks about if you have a spaceship, they're highly unstable if they land on the Earth. They'll crash, they'll go unstable. It's like you can't run electric power lines. You have to have them high up in the sky. If you bring them down low, all the energy is ground out of the earth and you lose your power. So we put our powers on insulators and we run the wires as high as we can. And so we don't lose the power. And it's the same with a ship. When these things come down close to Earth, the energy grounds out, they become unstable and they can crash. So you always see the pictures with a little landing gear coming down. And he says this is a landing pad for them to rise. And all of this is about the initiate going through the different levels of consciousness and training to purify the mind, purify the spirit, to be able to connect with the singularity and to be able to connect, to be able to go on a spaceship and travel to other places. And it's all about that praise to go and connect. And this was a landing platform. And you can see there the little stairway to heaven and the gods all holding their singularities going up to the platform where the ships could land. And this is limestone high off the ground, so it wouldn't ground out. It's an insulation, it's neutral insulation. So he sees that as a landing pad. And outside the temple, there's this massive, massive wall of clay, earthen bricks around the outside, which again are electrically neutral. It's like an insulator around the whole temple to help hold the vibration inside. Now, you wouldn't build, a wall that's this massive just for, keeping people out. He's actually for keeping energy in, he says, to hold that energy in the resonator. And there's this certain type of spiny weed that only grows in the places in Egypt where the biggest power objects are. It only is seen around the temples, which still have the power in them. And there are these spiny things, and the Kismet Mystery School people talk about that the government decided they didn't like these and tried to poison them and cut them and get them rid of them because they were all spiny and nasty, but they just grow right back again. They couldn't keep them out. But you only see them around these temples within the walls of the area where the energy is still intact. many of you have seen the Thrive movie, and there's a picture of this temple, which was underground and actually in water. We were wondering if we can go to it because it depends on what the water level is. Now, why is there a water table like this in Egypt where the water table is way down there? But yet in this temple and in certain other places like the Great Pyramid, there's still water that comes up into them and holds it. So you can see the massive blocks of this temple on the big stones, and it's really similar to things that you find in Peru, really, really similar. And you can see the water right there in the base. And even the way the corners are cut, they didn't just run corners, they actually have a single block cut in the corner in order to hold the energy. And Nassim talks about if you're running the vibration, the resonance in this thing, you really have to hold this thing together in order to hold that resonance in that chamber. And there's all sorts of rooms with these doors going into these little room chambers. But you remember from the Thrive movie, they talked about this ancient flower of life that was etched into the stone. This is where it was. And it's not just a surface type someone scratched in with graffiti. It's actually into the matrix of the rocks, like it was laser etched in. These days we'd have to use, powerful lasers to try to convert the stone inside and make this sort of line with the symbol of the flower of life. So further up the Nile, we took this incredible balloon ride, looking at everything from the air, looking down on the temples and also the Valley of the Kings. And here's these, beautiful lion-headed Sphinx, not pictures of a guy, but lion-head Sphinx in front. And inside the temple are these huge, towering towers of pillars. And it was interesting in this one, there was a chamber that was rebuilt. These towers, again, are all limestone, right? Built during dynastic Egypt. But this was especially hard stone with a real matrix of crystalline structure in it. And they reassembled it. And inside of it, there was an incredible resonance inside of that we all sat inside and ohmed in this reconstruction of a resonance chamber. And Sekhmet's statue was still intact. Now, rarely anywhere in Egypt do you see a statue still in its original location. They've all been robbed and taken to other places, but this was special because the Sekhmet was still where she was made. And again, this is pre-cataclysmic piece because it's an incredibly hard stone inside of a limestone cavern. And you see the place for the Holy of Holies, the sarcophagus, or the place where they would place the Holy of Holies. It's the central piece of every one of these temples. And you see the granite bases around the outside and the granite piece that it sits on top of, and then the rest of it you see as a limestone placed on top of it. And what do you see? Sucker got blown. Solid, super hard piece of granite, cracked and fissured in interesting ways. What's really amazing is the obelisks. Oh my God. Now the original obelisk didn't have, hieroglyphics on it. They were solid, and during dynastic Egypt they would carve hieroglyphics in it. They didn't make them. They were already there. But the ability for these things to stand up this amount of time, like these are tuning forks up into the sky. And we try to copy that these days with all sorts of monuments in Washington, D.C. Everyone's got to have their obelisks. And in fact, some white boys came from Europe and decided we want to get one of these obelisks and take it back to Europe. And they tried to bring them down carefully without breaking them, but they kept smashing one after another, bringing them down. There were 14 of these originally, and I think there's 3 or 4 still remaining that they didn't destroy. And here's a piece of one that was laying down. They put on this piece, and if you bang that tip with your hand, the whole thing rings like a bell. And the structure of the molecules within it, the alignment of the structure is just incredible. The way they're in an alignment, like the whole thing was like melted and recasted. It's almost not like a natural rock. They don't know how this rock could have been there and be tuned. Like, how do you take a giant piece of rock and tune it so you hit one side and the whole thing rings like a bell? In a few places you can see some of their technology where they had a hole saw here where they could drill a hole into the stone. And it's the depth part where they're drilling in and around the outside is really thin. Like it was a tiny, thin type of drill type of piece, which today we'd have a hard time having a drill that hard to cut into that rock with a bead around the outside that thin. But that was a nice little piece to kind of see how that technology was done and what they must have had. So you see where the obelisks and the statues are, and the statues are pre-cataclysmic, but then they built dynastic Egypt period, limestone temples around them, around the original pieces that were there. And you see that with these statues here. And here's one of the obelisks with the, rising in the sky. It's just incredible sight to see. And here again, you see these statues with hard granite limestone, pre-cataclysmic culture, and a limestone dynastic Egypt temple built around it. But at the base of each one of these statues, they look kind of masculine, but at the base, they always have a feminine. So they're unifying the masculine and feminine and realizing that both forms have to be there. So you see that all over the place on the statues. You see the feminine also a part of it. Now some of these have been rebuilt and lift back up into place. What's interesting is wherever you see these ancient things, this is a mosque sitting right there on top of an dynastic Egypt temple. And they have no problem like having their mosque right where the power is. And not just the Muslims that do that, like right across the street, here's the Sphinx, here's that same temple we were at, and right across the street is a Catholic church. So everyone wants to line up with the power because they know that, this is a ley line, this is an important spot, and connect in. Now there's an area called the Temple, the Valley of the Kings. That's where the burial sites were, and there's these tunnels going deep into the earth. Now these tunnels were not done by the pharaohs. They were the tunnels that these incredible hard stones were pulled out of because they didn't have the technology to dig tunnels like this. They can cut limestone, but they couldn't cut into granite hillsides and get granite rock out of deep into tunnels where they're looking for the finest of granite. So they used the tunnels that they found, and they kind of put some plaster on the inside and squared them off and put all their hieroglyphics in it. But what the tunnels were was ancient tunnels that they were used, and they would grab the sarcophaguses from different places they found them, drag them down in here, and bury their pharaohs in it, which is why we think the sarcophaguses were for burying pharaohs. That wasn't their original function, but that was what the function became. So they were just, this is where you can see the plastering of the walls, where they squared it off with plaster, and since it's underground, it was really well preserved and sealed off and not opened until modern times and hidden till we had ground-penetrating radar to find out where these things were. But the beautiful, it was so beautiful there as a color, and all the work in it, was beautifully preserved. And it's all about, the pathway into the heavens. It's like a roadmap for how to navigate the stars, how to navigate the galaxies, how to find the place you want to get to when you die. Like roadmaps on how to get there and how to find your way to that spot. And again, it's all about the ships, and you always see the singularities and the power inside the ships moving. And the ships indicating, well, that's not just a ship on a river, it's actually, according to Sim, a way of astral travel. Now, what was amazing to go was an ancient mine, open pit mine, where they dug deep down, and they had the Unfinished Obelisk. There were two of them. This is one of them here, where they were digging up, and you can see how they carved the obelisks and where they came from. And this is a deep pit of really trying to get to the right type of stone. They moved a lot of material out of the way to get to a vein that was actually solid rock and could actually work. And we got to really get down and see, so how did they carve this? And we know they were using plasma, beams from a singularity, plasmifying rocks. But in this place, we got to actually see the waveforms that were created, not just grinding it and chiseling it, but there were waveforms grinding a little bit at a time in order to carve this out. And Nassim really went off on this. We were all got so excited to look at it and see each thing, understand like how they're doing it, and he hadn't seen this before either, so it was new to him to really, finally have the evidence for what we knew isn't to see how it was done. And you really got to see all the, how they shot the energy and the waveforms. And it wasn't just the waveform was going down, but it actually went down underneath the obelisk and carved underneath, and then made that flattened area. So that's not just stair steps right there. It was actually the waveforms coming down, curling underneath, to start to take what was underneath. Because how do you get this huge piece of stone? How do you get underneath it and carve the bottom side out? And what do you do when you get that last little pit before you got to drop it down? And so here you can see the waveforms actually scooping out piece at a time and going deep underneath the obelisk and carving out the stone. So that was exciting. So then you see the walls carved around the obelisk in order to carve it out. And this one had a crack in the middle of it, so they got it to a certain point and then they abandoned it because it wasn't perfect enough, and so it was left there from pre-12,000 years ago till now for us to see how they did it. Now in the middle of the Nile there's an island called Elephantine Island, and the color of the Nile River was really beautiful. But I was surprised how small the river was, really. I was expecting some huge, massive thing. It wasn't a huge river at all. But the water and the purity and the feel of that water and the viscosity of it was just like nothing else. Like the only thing I can compare it to is being in the cenote caves of underground caves underneath Tulum in Mexico, and being in those and feeling this really special water underneath the Mayan pyramids in the cenote caves. And it kind of had that feeling in the water. So jumping in that water, you could really be in denial. Sorry. So here in Elephantine Island, they had a limestone dynastic Egypt temple. They were reassembling and you can see how they're putting some concrete and trying to reform how it was again and try to build it back up again. But the part we were interested in was on the other side of this sign. And you go through this sign and you go into the real stuff, which was the ancient pieces where you have the sarcophaguses, you have the stones. And there were 3 of these, that were all in a line, and they all kind of blew up and tipped over and, had all sorts of signs of blowing. And all around it you see this, stacked up stones and different time periods of building things later around it of what was there. But the original stuff was this heavy granite and the bases and everything that was there. And so they're like little temples that they would put them in. So there were sarcophaguses that were open with a lid to hold the really ones. And they had these where they put like shrines, and they put the singularities and the power that they would pull into these, and they were open front with the things that would hang in front of it to hold the energy inside. The smaller ones would go in these, and the big ones had to go inside the sarcophaguses with lids, according to Nassim. And all these showed signs of not only falling over, but, blowing apart into pieces and stuff. The same type of picture you see everywhere. Now you see all this stuff not just in Egypt, but you see the same patterns in Mexico, and even Indonesia has their pyramids. And you see the same, in the center of Egypt, that's the center hall going down into the king's chamber. You see that same sort of pattern and the same sort of mummies, the same type of temple builder cultures were all around the world. Even that temple we went to that was underwater in Egypt, well, here's a similar sort of piece in pre-Inca land, has the same sort of look to it. And even you look at the stonework that you see in Egypt, you see the same stonework in Peru and other parts of the world. This is that temple builder time. And the similarities between different places just go on and on. This picture of the 3 doors and all sorts of things, you see that shown all over the place. So they remember the time period where I said it was building, and they try to say the Great Pyramid of Cheops. They say Cheops because Mr. Pharaoh Cheops carved his name on the door someplace, and they thought, oh, that must be his. He must have built it. And the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom. And then after that, nothing else got built in the middle of the New Kingdom around the time of King Ramses. Well, King Ramses is when supposedly the exodus of Moses happened. And the story of Moses is very unique to what Nassim understands and what the Ark of the Covenant is and what happened. So we all know the story of, Moses and the Exodus and the parting of the Red Seas and the miracles and the wandering across the desert for 40 years. But Moses was very special, even though he was Jewish. The Egyptian priesthood recognized him as a very special being, and they took him in as a priesthood. They recognized, you're just not an ordinary being; you're somebody special. And he studied with the priesthood, and he had the ability to be able to operate a singularity, which was only for the highest of the high people to be able to even come near these things, to really and come near them and operate them. So in Sim's story of Moses, when Moses left and he got the download to take your people out of there, he took the singularity with him. And this is the picture of the story, and the story is this huge bright light went across the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parted. Well, now these singularities operate a lot on water. Remember, we're talking everything's about the water and attracting and moving water, and that's one of the things they do. So Nassim's thing of one of these singularities could easily have the force in order to push that water back and hold the water. So we all know the story that he opens the Red Sea, parts, the people walk through, and when they get to safety on the other side, and the Pharaoh's army is chasing after them, and then the Red Seas close, and all the king's men get crushed. And they said, forget this guy, we're not going to chase him anymore. And basically the story is he took the singularity with him, the one remaining one that apparently was still in Egypt that the dynastic period had, and that's how they moved their big stones. They even know the location where the Red Sea most likely parted, and that's a big sea. That's no minor type of opening. And so then Moses got the download to build the Ark of the Covenant to hold the Holy of Holies. So what was the Holy of Holies? What was the power object that the Ark of the Covenant was built for? Remember, it was built with wood and lined on the inside and outside with precious metals. That is basically the definition of a capacitor. It was built as a capacitor to hold the singularity. And I told you before how the ratio of that is perfect ratio with the sarcophagus of the Great Pyramid. So when they left, that's a major Red Sea they parted there. That was no small thing. Obviously, you'd think this guy is some powerful dude who could do that. And then they wandered through the desert for 40 years, and basically, Nassim says, no, they weren't wandering through the desert. The singularity would move to a new location on its own, and they'd follow it, and then they would set up camp where it was, and then, it was waiting for its moment in order to return to when it needed to go in the Holy Land. And I think some of the places in the Holy Land, there's, monolithic stone things underneath the grounds there. I think maybe that singularity used to live there once upon a time, and it wanted to go home. So there's the 40 years in the desert. But after they had it in the sarcophagus, they then noticed they crossed the River Jordan. And the stories go, when they crossed the River Jordan, the Holy of Holies inside of the Ark of the Covenant preceded them. And that opened up the water of the Jordan River so the people could cross the river. And so that's the story of the second crossing when they had the Ark of the Covenant with them. So obviously, it's the same power object as before. Sorry if this steps on anyone's theology, but that's my job description. So what was the Ark of the Covenant? And what was it used for? And what was, this is our history time now when we actually know something, supposedly. Well, you'll see in the ancient Egyptian frescoes, they had their own Ark of the Covenant too. They were parading their singularities in a thing that looked exactly like it and being carried in same ratio as what the Ark of the Covenant was. So it was about the sphere, the singularities that were being passed around. And when the Ark of the Covenant would move to a new location, they would make a whole temple around there in the desert, and each place they had, it was very important that there were certain things that had to be there for purifying it, and lights and crystals and water and holy objects in order to have offerings and stuff. And the original kosher, according to Nassim, was they would take the precious food they have and bring it to the singularity, and the power of the singularity would charge that with so much mana that would give everyone so much nourishment, and a little bit of food would go a long way. And that was the original koshering, not some priest putting his hand over it and charging some money. That came later. But when they had the singularity, then that was what it was. And then the mana from heaven was actually a spirulina making machine. And it would run for 6 days, and then they'd have to clean it and shut it down, and everyone didn't eat that day because they had to clean it. That's the 7th-day Sabbath. And so every 7 days they had to clean the thing and recharge it back up. But that was their source of food, because you have that number of people out there in the desert. There wasn't any, they weren't growing things, they had to have food. So that was how the food came from. It was blue-green algae that survived them, and whatever animals and just a little bit of other things they had that was all charged in mana from the singularity. So the words were is that as this thing would travel, there would be clouds and light above it, and clouds and dust and movement. Obviously, it had some serious power. Those are the descriptions in the Old Testament of exactly what it was. And when it finally got to its final location on the Temple Mound, the Temple of Solomon was built to house the singularity, where only the highest priest could go into that inner chamber. And outside was the same sort of things that with the tabernacles they would build around it out in the desert. They had the same sort of similar things within the Temple of David in order to purify the initiates before they went in. There was whole processes they would have to go through of initiation and how close you could come to it. And really the temple was only like once a year opened up and brought out and paraded around, and once a year on a very special occasion. And otherwise, it was held in there only for the highest, the priesthood. So then there's a story of the Walls of Jericho. They walked around with the Ark of the Covenant 7 times around, with the 7 priests with the 7 trumpets made of ram's horns. And they finally got to the certain place, and they ran the horn 7 times, and they hit a certain resonant frequency with the Ark of the Covenant next to it, and boom, the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. And then they stormed the place and killed everybody. Again, Nassim says this was using resonance. They amplified it by hitting the resonant and finding what the weak spot was and really understanding it, and then hitting the resonant frequency. They were able to hit that and cause the instability and just like a crystal shatter it. And then there's the stories of they would bring the Ark of the Covenant out in a war, and everybody would smath down with boils over their body and falling over. Well, that's kind of like, skin cancers and boils happening and getting very sick because of the power of the singularity. But the priests who were high in pure energy could hold that, and they used that in wars to defeat their enemies. And there was a time when the Ark of the Covenant was stolen, and the Philistines had it, and they traveled around for several months, and they took it around their whole area. But every place they went, people would die, and plagues would happen, and the people would get boils over their body, and it was really bad news. And in the end, they said, "Oh, we're really sorry. We're going to go give it back to you. And you guys can take this. Obviously, we don't know what we're doing, and it's causing bad stuff for us." And then they returned it. But under the Temple Mound, where it was housed, there were immense tunnels, and these are ancient tunnels, I believe. I haven't been there to confirm it, but there's huge monolithic stone rocks that these are made from. And it was kind of like they knew that at some point some war or something would come and people would try to steal this thing, and they would want to be able to whisk it away and hide it, in the bad times. And these, again, the tunnels under the Temple Mound, these look more like something from ancient Egypt times, and some, 50-ton boulders and stuff that were made from. It was no minor thing. And there's several of these tunnels they're finding underneath. And when the Knights Templar during the Crusades, everybody else was fighting, but the Knights Templar went down to these tunnels and they were digging through, trying to find them all, trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. They were after the power object. Nassim says that's what the Crusades were about. They thought it was still there, hidden in the tunnels, and they wanted to go back and find it, and they had to start a war to distract everybody so they can get down there and try to find it. And they never found it because it wasn't there. So the story is that there was a time when the Jerusalem was being sacked, and they took the Singularity out of Jerusalem, and they took it to the Essenes. The plan, that was a hiding place. The Essenes had caves. They're a very high spiritual group of people, and that was supposed to be a hiding place for the Ark of the Covenant when things went sour. And so there's all sorts of legends of the Ark of the Covenant with the Essenes. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, in many of it, talks about the initiation initiates had to go through in order to come near it. The purifications they had to do, the anointments they had to do to their body, and everything to be able to come close to a singularity, and the process they went through to purify their spirit. And Nassim's story is when Jesus went through to get the money changers and the merchants out of the temple of Solomon, he says, no, we got to get this out of here so we can return the Ark of the Covenant back to the temple where it belongs. They left it with the Essenes, and the Jewish priesthood said, no, we don't want the thing to come back. We're in control now, not that thing, and we like it this way, and we're making money, and we don't want to bring it back because we're controlling it. And if that thing comes, then we'll have to be pure again. And that was, according to Nassim, his story of what Jesus was trying to say, to cleanse the filth out of the temple so the singularity could return. So, obviously, eventually the guy got nailed, and then he resurrected. So Nassim's story is what happened is, Mary Magdalene and crew took the, that was Jesus getting pissed off at me, coming through my iPhone. They took him to the Singularity with the Essene caves to recharge the body, because this brings so much cohesion to the field that it can bring life back to things. It gives you long life, right? The gods of the ancient times lived 1,000 years, 1,200 years, because they could come next to the Singularity and recharge their energy and bring cohesion to their whole body and be able to live a long time and have long life. And so the resurrection was about taking his body there and bringing it back to life, and then he comes back. So these are the caves, the Essenes. These are the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, in the Essene caves. And that's the story of resurrection, that he came back to life. And obviously, he couldn't hang around there because the priests and the military and everything were after him. So the story is that Jesus went back to India. He went there before during the, quote, lost years of Egypt, and he went back there to live out the rest of his life. And after you're resurrected, you're not quite the same form as you were originally. You're a little bit disjuncted, so it takes, a little toll on the body to resurrect from the dead. And there's all sorts of reports. And when I was my 5 years in northern India, I was all sorts, even right up in Ladakh, there's all sorts of stories of Jesus being there and Jesus being here. And they all have their stories of Jesus being around. And Mary Magdalene, she took off to France, according to the stories. And there's all sorts of legends in France that Mary Magdalene was there, in the cult of Mary Magdalene in France. And she took the Singularity with her, because they couldn't leave it with the Essenes anymore, because that was too hot. So Singularity whisked off with her and went to France. But they were chased down, and eventually Mary Magdalene was killed. But then the Singularity was whisked back off again to Ethiopia. And there's this temple in Ethiopia where all sorts of legends, the Ark of the Covenant was supposedly hidden deep down in a cavern way, way deep, and nobody was allowed to come close to that. And it was whisked away and kept out of form. And that may have been the power of Haile Selassie and all the stories we hear about Ethiopia and the Jews there. So Nassim doesn't think that it's still there anymore. He thinks the Jewish army came and whisked it away. And there was a rescue of the Ethiopian Jews twice. And in fact, the second time they came with squadrons of Hercules jets and airlifts 14,000 Ethiopian Jews out in the 30s. They came in with a huge squat team. And he thinks at that time they whisked off they went over there, raided it, got the Singularity, and it's now living in a cave somewhere in Israel. Oh, he can't prove that. But that's where he thinks it is right now. So were there other singularities on this planet that survived at this time? Yes. Muhammad had one. And it's buried deep underneath, in Mecca. And deep underneath that is a singularity buried in the ground that you can measure from space the power coming off this point. And when the people start walking around, the power that comes off that you can measure from space is massive. And every Muslim is supposed to go and, make that thing and touch the Rosetta Stone and connect to that singularity to charge them up, to give them long life and to purify their souls. According to Nassim, that's what's actually going on deep underneath there. And another one, we all know the story of the Bermuda Triangle. Planes disappearing, all sorts of things happening. And that all happened right up until the 1980s or so, and then suddenly we didn't hear about it anymore. And Nassim says, well, yes, there was a singularity and ancient stuff underneath, especially around Bimini, that there were ancient ruins there, and there was a singularity that was left that was causing a vortex and sucking things into it. And the military tried to take it, but they couldn't get close to it. They'd just toast anybody. If a submarine went close to it, all the people would vaporize and the submarine would whisk off the other direction. And finally they said, well, forget this. We're just going to encase it because we can't have things disappear anymore. And they dumped all sorts of concrete and metal and lead and shielded it to dumb it down enough so it would quit causing harm. And supposedly, some of the documents of this are finally coming to surface years later, and we're going to start learning about what really happened when the military did this. Because there's a History Channel Ancient Alien series about things they're finding underneath the water and around the Bermuda Triangle area, some underground temples. And you can dive to some of these stoneworks underneath the waters of these ancient walkways and stuff. So something submerged there. So let's keep traveling around the world. You guys know this. This is Petra in Turkey. No, Jordan, pardon me. And this was carved out of one giant rock out of the hillside. One giant rock. It was not, it couldn't be hand chiseled. The perfection with this is too much. And obviously it's made for some very tall people to live in there. And so that's Petra. Jordan, I spent a lot of time in Bali, and Bali has its own Petra carved out of one rock out of the hillside. Gunung Kawi is the big one. It's near the water temple of Tempek Sering. And it's carved out of one hillside, out of one giant rock, and the local lore says it was carved by the giants with their fingernails. So they have the legends of the giant race that lived amongst humans, and they had a lot of powers, and they were giants, and every now and then they'd find a human kind of tasty, and they'd snatch them up and eat it. So in order to stop that from happening, they put offerings out for the giants to give them their best food and their best things, and offer, here, eat this instead of us, please, and try to get a symbiotic relationship going so they'd quit snatching up their kids. And to this day, they're still leaving offerings out, right? And again, they don't know when this was built. And it could not have been built with any technologies they had because they didn't have the tools to be able to carve out a giant rock. Of course, the Balinese understand ceremonies, so they're going to do their ceremonies in front of these. And this is the monkey dance. And right behind it, you see something that looks like a chamber for a singularity. And you see these same sort of rock forms that you see in other parts of the world. This same design right there you see all over Peru. you see that 3-window type of form in different forms. The 3 windows going into the chamber. And this looks like a shrine for the Holy of Holies to go, like other places with some chambers around it, right? And here you can see on the right side, you're right, it's carved out of one rock, and on the left side they did some restoration with bricks. Very different type of creations. And even the walkway going down, one giant rock carved out as you walk down. And the gates, again, this is not added, this is one rock that they carved to create the gate. And that form of the gate is still used today in Bali. You'll see that gate and that wall system still in Bali today. That's what they put around their homes, their temples, that same form. Now right next to that is a water temple at Tempe Exering, but you notice that is a bunch of small bricks stacked up. But my guess is probably underneath there you're going to see some megalithic stone things underneath it. And there's small ones, like right in Ubud, right downstream from the place I sometimes stay, Michi Retreat, there's a small one of these. Shrine in the middle, little thing looked like singularity chambers on either side. And what was remarkable, when you go inside and you look up at the ceiling, it's got that same ceiling look of the 4 sides with the carving down the center that you see in the Balinese houses today. And you see that same design in the sarcophaguses of Egypt with that type of ceiling. So I believe these were used to house singularities, and the giants were the other race that was here maybe 12,000 years ago, maybe other times, I'm not sure. But you look at the little temple shrines inside, and that looks almost exactly like the Temple of the Sun that the Mayans have. That same design around the world. And these are not just in Ubud, but you see these all over Bali. And people don't fully regard or understand what they are. So we all know we're finding pyramids all over the world now. It's on all the power points in the grid structure around the planet. Recent one, the largest one in the world, was found in Bosnia, and like, how can you not think that was a pyramid? Like, just 10 years ago they figured it out. And they're digging down, they're finding tunnels and giant megalithic stone things and measuring the power off it, and 10 years ago they just thought that was a mound. How can you miss that? So what I'm interested in is, what do we have on Maui? What do we have in the Hawaiian Islands? We have these things called the Pyramid Rock in Molokai, this little island. Right? Maybe a pyramid. We have Pyramid Rock Lighthouse in Kaneohe Bay in Oahu. Looks like a little pyramid. We have one called Pu'u Haleakala near Punalu'u, Oahu. Looks interesting, like a pyramid. So obviously they're all over the world. Are we going to find the pyramids of Hawaii? I'm curious. I want to start looking more at these things and seeing what we really find. There's the same Pu'u Haleakala. So now as I'm tuning into these things more, I want to explore this more and more. So that's my presentation. 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 35 seconds. Now open to questions and keep them specific, because I want to get a chance for everybody.
When you're talking about the tall columns, the pillars at Luxor, are those like granite also?
No, those are limestone. So those are built during dynastic Egypt time, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And that's how you tell the difference. But you look on the ground below that, and the stonework on the base is giant granite stones, indicating it was built on the ruins of something from pre-cataclysmic times. But they obviously had some juju to lift those giant things up there and put them in place. So they still had the power of the singularity and the consciousness to create some anti-gravity in order to move things with anti-gravity. But they didn't have the ability to plasmify rock and cut stones. They didn't. That was a little too much consciousness.
Thank you.
In Singularity, I noticed there were snakes on both sides of the sphere.
Uh-huh.
Is this activated by the masculine energy masculine and feminine energy? So
Oh,
before they had the
I don't know about masculine and feminine, but it definitely shows the waveforms. You saw the picture of the singularity with the waveforms going out, which is just like when you see in our galaxy. You know, as things go out, they're not just going out, but there's also waves like this. In 2012 was us actually passing through the galactic center of our galaxy, you know, as where that moment was passing through our galactic center into another hemisphere of the waveform going up and down.
Is the wave also part of the Kundalini energy?
Yeah, Kundalini is a part of that whole thing. That's our wave. So wherever you have a life form, you have to have spinning energy, and you're going to create a vortex in the center, which is our Kundalini. And that's going to have pieces that are going to go with it as well. Mark.
In the Serpent of Light book from Balu talks about the energy moving from the Himalayas to South America. Can you comment on that?
Well, we're definitely seeing, like, that's the, you know, there's a masculine and feminine forms, and the Himalayas is a masculine. It was all about the monasteries and the men and that old energy. And in South America, what the energy they were holding was the more feminine aspect. You know, it was based in earth energy and earth energy worship and a different sort of form. They had the singularities there too. You had the pre-Inca. You have the Inca civilization where they blocked up small blocks and they made things with small blocks. And the pre-Inca, which was the big megalithic stone things, you know, which suffered the same fate as the other things. They blew up from the inside. I haven't been there yet, but I'm going to be going there in November because Nassim's next trip is to Peru. And we're signed up. Sancho's going to go with me this time. Yeah, the Sacred Valley. I'm looking forward to that and really experiencing. We both spent a lot of time in the Himalayas, and I'm ready to catch the feminine form.
I have a question. What era did this take place in? Like, how many years ago?
Well, we are talking about two periods. One was ended 12,000 years ago, probably started 30,000 years ago. But it probably had, if you follow the weather patterns, and what the lore is it probably had its heyday from, around 18 to 12,000 years ago, when the Earth had a period of time between one ice age and before the next one happened. You know, we had stable weather and stable climate, and that was the heyday of that whole time period.
Two-part question. So, do you think in roughly 20,000 more years, they're going to look back on everything we created and be like, why are in all these different parts of the world there's the same stuff constructed in the same vehicles? And I think in 20,000 years they're going to do the same thing, like, what is this? Why are these nuclear power plants the same in all these different places?
Well, we're still a very young civilization. We're maybe a 100,000-year-old species, maybe. You know, if we were GMO'd 100,000 years ago by the Anunnaki or whatever the story goes. And so we're still a very young species. But when you reach to be a million-year-old civilization, like, you know, other places, you know, you have to evolve from being a competitive species to being a cooperative species. So we're still in a kindergarten, you know, fighting over the crayons and shitting in our pants, you know. And you don't give singularities to crazy people like us because we're just going to make bombs out of it and throw it at each other.
Have they been doing that since like 20,000 years ago, the same kind of systems going through?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stories of ETs having, you know, different gods having wars. And
We're always building buildings. We're doing the Colosseums. It's always the same. We're working. We're building things for the kings. It seems like the same kind of circle humans are running in.
Well, what we're looking at back then, back to 12,000 year civilization, is according to Sim, was a very egalitarian. It was a very high civilization. It wasn't about competition. It was about balancing masculine and feminine. All the forms had to balance. It wasn't a male god. It was always a masculine and feminine together. Everything had to be in union and harmony and resonance.
Always a god, no matter what era we're in.
Well, what if they were gods? What we're looking at in our gods is, you know, who are these gods we called? And, you know, we're basically looking at it saying, well, they were beings from other planetary systems that came here, and they had some technology, and we all bowed to them and said, okay, I mean, you got the power to do this. I'm going to bow to you, and I'm going to follow what you have to say because you got some juju. You know?
It's probably just us from the future bringing the technology to the past.
Yeah, but what Sim talks about is that in order for the human species to grow up, We have to find the God within. We can't look for the God without. And so all these religions that were based on the external God rather than coming inside were archaic and not beneficial. So maybe this cataclysm is something that had to happen to wipe these other civilizations off. The Galactic Federation comes in and says, okay, no more showing up as their gods for them. You know, you got to cloak yourselves and, you know, not show up and be their rulers for them anymore. Let them make all the mistakes themselves and grow up and go through their process so that we can reach that point of our own ascension and find that we are one with the divine, that there's no separation. And we finally reach that point. And so maybe there's a whole divine process as to what cleaned all these civilizations off this planet, and we had these religions that got seeded to find the God within rather than the God on the outside.
Do you know if Nassim's got any particular view on the pyramids not just being energy generators, but perhaps transmitters to outer space?
Yeah, they were used for all sorts of purposes. They were there generating plants. They were power grids. They were also put on certain power points on this planet in order to, charge the planet up and bring harmony and resonance to this planet. Okay, I'm going to go down the rabbit hole with you. So what happened to some of these beings in Atlantis and Lemuria when they sunk and they blew up and this whole thing happened? Well, some of these beings were very high and could shapeshift. And Nassim talks about they went inside the planet to become the intra-terrestrial species that are the inside of a planet. That inside of Earth is a hollow sphere, and there's a light center, a singularity in the center, and it's very nice in there because it's cozy and it doesn't change temperatures and it's constant. And there's a whole crystalline world inside of this planet. Like Earth is like a big geode, and a geode is looks like a rock on the outside, but inside is a whole crystal. And there's a whole crystalline world of very high evolved beings, and the extraterrestrials come from other places, come in these metal flying saucer things, some technology that they built. But the intra-terrestrials come out of the Earth in plasma ships. So when you see the lights that morph and change and move like this, like they're one with their ship. They're not separate from beings. They're not building a technology. They're higher enough to evolve and do that. That's the source of the orbs that we see. They're intra-terrestrial energies coming out, the nature spirits that have been guardians of this planet for eons to hold it. That energy is held inside the Earth, and we've been kind of blocked from connecting with that world because we're still in kindergarten. And the time is coming now where, the portals are opening and a lot of activities happening in, for instance, Antarctica, where even the Pope has gone to Antarctica and all these Illuminati characters have gone to Antarctica. And there's an ancient civilization underneath there, and there's a portal opening to inner Earth at the Antarctica. And so the time of contact. We're not allowed because, but some people have made it in there, reported what the inner Earth looks like and what that crystalline world was like. Yes?
So Bruce, how do you draw all this wonderful technology and information into something that's significant for us? Where do we take this?
That's the ultimate question. Thank you for that one. Sir James, top of the room. It's to understand our ancient past, where we came from and where we're going to, that it's time for us to grow up and to join our galactic world, that we're not the only show on we're not the only show in the galaxy here, and that we've been a very protected place and walked over. We're kind of like a national park where ETs can, fly through and look at the wildlife, but don't disturb the wildlife or affect them in any way. Let them go through their own process. But we're going to a time when we're going to connect with our galactic friends and become part of the Galactic Federation, is how we say. And so... Are
you with the Federation or the Rebels?
I work for the Galactic Federation. Yes?
Just with the final statement, or the last statement that we just made about, so just what I thought was, how about when we look at you looking at me, we attempt to as far back as we can possibly see. And because we're talking about resonance, be open to that resonant flow between us.
Well, it's just like we each have a singularity, like we have a spiritual concept that we're all one, right? We know that spiritually, we feel that. But we have to have a science that also, a physics that also unifies that to understand what that is. Our two worlds can't be separate right now. We've got science on one side and spiritual people on the other. And so, no, they got to become one in harmony, understand what that is. So what Nassim has done is to really shown how we have a singularity. We have a 0 point where we're connected to everybody, and we're all connected through wormholes to every other living being on this planet. And that's how we are one, how we do connect with each other, and where our higher consciousness comes from. I don't know if I answered the question, but... It wasn't a question. Okay. Good, then I didn't have to answer it. Yes.
I believe that Jesus was able to figure out his 0 point without using the Ark of the Covenant, and that's why he was able to perform all these miracles. And I believe that he also taught these to Mary Magdalene, and that's why she went to France, because she had his unborn child that was Saint Mary, the first royal bloodline of France. You know, and that's why she took this to the secret, and that's why the Knights Templar kept that secret, because they knew of this bloodline, and she passed this knowledge to other people, and you didn't need the covenant at all. The covenant was just a tool, but really you have the power. You're just pure energy when it comes to it. When you realize that you're pure energy, then you could access all this energy by yourself without a box, without any gold or copper.
Right. Well, we actually have an Ark of the Covenant right here. We have our singularity. And through consciousness, we connect that and bring forth the real power. So the whole thing of an external power source, although that would certainly be nice, that we can run our lights and drive our cars and have all that, but that's, one of the ideas of the zero free energy devices. I think sometimes, there have been so many free energy devices brought forth, and the military and the men in black come and snap it away and banish the people who put it out. And I think sometimes that that's being kept from us, because we're just not ready for that yet. We're not grown up enough. We don't have a way of not letting the bad boys get a hold of it and overamp it and use it for evil purposes. And it's kind of waiting for us to get some unity consciousness where we can, say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Sir James.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that it's time for at least some to go beyond the description and to describe. And I happen to feel that Maui is the community breakthrough. As a community, try to actually initiate this amongst ourselves and see where it goes.
If we can't do it on Maui, where can we do it?
Oh, I know that we're on another conscious than the rest of the people in the world here on Maui. Another conscious, another level of consciousness on the island.
It's a good place for ideas to spread because it's traveled by everybody.
Yes, Haleakala is the largest mountain in the world. Starts in the ocean floor. Question from somebody else. Yes.
I don't really understand. If you could explain a little bit more how the plasma thing, like going to the west, plasma is the way they cut those stones, because I would love to understand that. What does that mean?
Well, 99.99% of the universe is plasma. It's disorganized energy. It's kind of like Nassim describes it. You got your bathtub, right? And you pull the plug in the bathtub and it starts to spin going down the hole. Well, that's like a singularity. That's like organized. It's starting to organize into something, by spinning. It's making energy. And the rubber ducky, when you put it will start going in a circle like this, right? But the rubber ducky on the other side, away from that little hole, is just going to bounce around kind of like this. That's plasma. It's still disorganized. And when it starts to spin and starts becoming something, then it starts forming in different sorts of forms. So all of this universe is actually plasma still in, particles and disorganized, not brought together again. And so the idea of plasmifying is like starting to run a solid toward a liquid, or starting a liquid toward a gas, or taking a gas toward plasma. So when they make plasma inside of the singularity, when science wants to make plasma, they're basically doing like a lightning storm. They take argon gas and they slam it with high power lasers, and they blast it with energy, and they disorganize it, argon gas, back into plasma form, and that's how you create plasma gas. And one way it's done. And so what Nassim's doing in that is using that technology and spinning it in the double tube torus configuration of a singularity to create the boundary conditions of a singularity to create that energy form in order to have an anti-gravity device. That's the power that runs those things. And so with consciousness, that's a mechanical, a man-made, by humans using wires and cables and computers and kind of primitive technology. But from 1 million-year-old technology, it's an organic type of thing that's spinning, and it's a thing that's been brought, here as a thing. And that's what they had back then. That was the singularities, that were the spheres. Inside the middle was the eye of Horus, was the singularity, and outside that was a boundary condition, just like you have around any singularity. We have our singularity here, and this is our boundary condition right here that makes this. And with consciousness, you can guide that energy into a rock and take that rock with that energy and start turning it from a solid toward a liquid. That's called plasmifying it. And once the rock is sort of liquid, well, then you can cut it with a butter knife and do whatever you want to it, because it's, that's the semi-liquid form. And then you can push it into a location, and then it slowly cools, and then it forms a solid rock in the new form of how you need it to be in that spot, because you reformed it. You didn't cut the angles and get everything this and that and make everything, you liquefied it and throw it in place. And you can see the rocks as they cool. Some pictures of it where you can see them cool, and they bulge in the middle like this, because you stack another rock on top, and the force of that, each one of the rocks have a little bulge in them as they're cooling. And so that's the plasmifying idea. Yeah, you may.
From a perspective of some very ancient spiritual techniques, such as Wiccan magic, which is based around the balance of the 5 elements. The 5th element is ether. My personal feeling is that's the same thing as plasma. And in those systems, the perfect harmony of the human being is said to be when the pentagram is actually completely balanced. So it's like you have all the different frequencies of each element in balance with each other. So it's like that's when you become a overtime, or like an over unity, and you're actually producing more than you're consuming. So in my opinion,
well, the Sim talks about we are a free energy device. The food that we eat, it takes more energy to digest the food we eat than energy we get from the food we eat. In other words, we are connecting with the vacuum, which in the Sim's turn is highly organized and infinitely dense, the opposite of what we think it is. And we're connecting in with that, we're deriving our energy, and all living things actually do that. I mean, there's plants growing out of air, not connected to anything. Every living form is actually a free energy device. Yes?
But, so plasma is essentially invisible, right?
Plasma is the 4th state of matter. Life and creation, right?
Yeah.
Invisible.
Invisible to us, yes.
Invisible to us. But to plasmify something, I mean, you put a stick of butter in the microwave and you melt it, and you're essentially plasmifying it.
You are, in a sense. You're adding energy to it, in order to bring it from one state to another. Yeah. Yeah, I showed the 4 states in the things. We say plasmifying, so I'm not saying we're turning rock into plasma. We're actually... Yeah, let me give them the Sims information if I could. Yeah. So then you're taking the rock and you're adding energy to it, and you're starting to make it liquid. So you're plasmifying it by taking that type of energy and changing its state. Last question. Somebody hasn't talked yet. Yes.
So you talk about us consuming a really dense form of energy or food that's actually a net negative energy for us. So does Nassim have like a diet? Like there's people that are breatharian.
He actually took a period of time when he was traveling around in a van, actually discovering all this geometry and doing a lot of study, where he was a breatharian. And he experienced that by connecting in through meditations and doing that. Now he's, kind of in the world and doing his thing and not just isolated in his little van, cruising around the forests and being quiet, so he's eating food and all that. But he went through that time period of doing that, and that's how breatharians are able to do that very thing. I got one other question here. I want to get somebody new.
So, in going off what he said, so would like fasting be considered? I mean, it's beneficial, but like what is a proper fast? Like not eating or like?
Well, people get a lot of energy during fasting because you're not putting your energy in digesting food. And if you're focusing your energy and really combining with the universe, you're getting a lot of, use that in meditation, you get a lot of energy from that. Now, we also need some molecules because we can synthesize, we can do alchemy. We're doing alchemy in our body all the time. We're turning iron into gold and all sorts of things within our body. We're doing alchemy. That's what singularities do. They create new forms. Black holes create alchemy, they create all the metals in the universe out of the blast hole from the black hole in the center. But in the spiritual sense, there's many levels of reasons for doing fasting. So you shut down your system for a while. The highest really fasting when you're no longer taking any sort of sugars in, and your body goes into a place of gluconeogenesis where you're breaking down proteins, in your body to turn that into sugars. And the body goes around and finds the proteins that first need to be removed, like cancer cells and this inflammation. Because once all the proteins that are slated for removal, it's pretty damn smart, figures all that out on its own. And that's when you're not taking any sugars in your body in any form so that you're getting into that state. It doesn't mean you can't be taking some broths and things to get some nutrients. But we can't really fool ourselves and thinking, I can become a breatharian and get skinny and not make it, because you really have to tune your body and be ready for that whole thing. And consciousness, it's a consciousness thing. Okay, last one for you.
Is it possible that when everything exploded all at once, it was like a magnetic shift from all the poles shifting?
It probably created a lot of shifts. Thank you. That was my burning question while I was there, was what was the cataclysm? Because we kept talking about this and all the stories of, something, comet hitting the earth and earthquakes and, big tidal waves. Didn't make sense for what I was seeing. And I didn't accept that explanation. I kept asking that question in my mind. And sometimes you keep asking something, you get the answer. And I think something really hit me because I just saw this whole vision of all the singularities and all these sarcophaguses going all across the planet. Because Nassim said, we had thousands of them back then. Every megalithic stone sculpture had these things. They had their Holy of Holies. They had their central thing about the priesthood who could come close to this and operate it. And that's how they, built all those civilizations were built with these big stones. And they all disappeared 12,000 years ago in Turkey, in Peru, in Mexico, in Egypt. And what happened? So something happened to this planet that made the surface pretty inhospitable. But there were still people living here who survived that and continued to repopulate and grow and move back again. But we had, like I said, a 6,000 year period after that of no major civilizations, just hunter-gatherers kind of getting it together and forming civilization again. So we think history started 6,000 years ago. For us, that's what history talks about. Before that was just hunter-gatherers, but they ignore this whole other thing that was pre-12,000 years ago, and who knows how far back it actually goes. Like, who knows how far back those pyramids were really built? Maybe they were built 80,000 years ago. It's hard to say. But we know that ended 12,000 years ago. So I'm still got to take that theory and, work it out. And Nassim is putting it in his meditations and really looking at it. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to let him hear my little presentation here. And it's the same presentation I was upgraded, but I just gave it in Bali to about 100 people in Bali, and I gave it here on my birthday in December. And I feel like it's time to get this information out. It's timely, and I've been in a fortunate position to be with Nassim and have it. And so this is my beginnings of trying to rise into a teacher role and try to share this information. And eventually I'm going to work on some other things, diving more into the physics and, other sorts of things. I'm trying right now to kind of get the pulse and see what people are ready for and what they want to hear, and see how far down the rabbit hole they want to go before they fall asleep. And I'm also going to eventually put one together about how our weather is engineered. How many of you would like to know that?
Yeah, I'm looking for a techie, by the way, to create a website with chemtrail videos and photos.
Okay, I got a whole other story than that one, though. Okay, thank you guys. Mahalo.